Hi, and welcome to Nature Study, the natural way to study science. Let's go back to 1666. The plague is spreading through London. Many buildings are closed, and students have to leave Cambridge University. A young scientist leaves for his home, the one he grew up in Lincolnshire. As he sits in the orchard near his home, with his back up against a tree, he observes apple after apple falling from the tree. His observations, coupled with the countless hours of research he did in college, lead to a small but very critical principle. I bet you can guess the principle and the scientist at this point. You're right. It's gravity and Isaac Newton. Observing nature has played an important role in science, and today we're going to chat about how we can teach science through nature. Hi, I'm Paige, and I've authored more than 20 books to help homeschoolers just like you teach science. But more than that, we have enjoyed studying nature in our homeschool for over 10 years. So science kind of began as people saw things in nature and went to seek out the answers. So in a way, nature study is the grandmother of hands-on science, because we can observe the principles of science in nature and then we can learn more about them. So science was born out of this observation of nature, and observation is still key today when we're talking about nature study. So what is nature study? Well, nature study is this beneficial tool we have, and we can use it in our homeschool to help teach our students about science. So at its core, nature study is simply about finding science in nature. It's about seeing science face to face. So it's about learning about gravity as we watch that apple fall. And nature study can be about learning about the different states of matter as we observe a frozen waterfall. We can learn about the life cycle of a butterfly as we observe and find eggs for the monarch on our milkweed, and then we hatch those into caterpillars and we watch the chrysalis form, and then we see our butterflies emerge. So all that is part of nature study and how we can learn about the principles of science or the things we're reading about or studying in science and finding those things in nature. So one of my most favorite resources for nature study is the Handbook of Nature Study by Anne Botsford Comstock. Now, this is a resource for us adults, but in there she says that nature study cultivates the child's imagination. She says there's so many wonderful and true stories that he can read with his own eyes, which affect his imagination as much as fairy lore. So we can go out into nature and we can see the story of science presented in front of us so that our children are inspired to learn more about science through the stories they see unfold in front of them. She goes on to say that at the same time, nature study cultivates in him a perception and a regard for what is true and the power to express it. So nature study puts a face on science and allows our students to not only see science, the principles of science face to face, but to be able to express them in words that they understand. And finally, she continues her thoughts on nature study by saying nature study gives the child practical and helpful knowledge. It makes him familiar with nature's ways and forces so that he's not helpless in the presence of natural misfortunes and disasters. So nature study gives our children a better understanding of what's going on in the world around them. I like to say that nature study awakens the scientific side of the brain in the same way a good book awakens the imagination. So I remember reading The Magician's Nephew, and it changed the way I looked at the world. It changed the way I looked at those green plastic rings we used to have, that we used to play with. It changed the way I looked at attics. And I always wanted to discover passages to secret worlds using different things. So a good book, like The Magician's Nephew, awakened my imagination to look at my world differently. And nature study can do the same thing for your children. It can awaken that scientific imagination within your students to look at their world differently, because now their science is not just principles or facts that they read in a book, but it's things they've seen. So they didn't just read about the life cycle of a butterfly. They saw it in action over a month. They found the eggs on the milkweed, and we raised those caterpillars all the way to a butterfly and released our butterflies and gave him a name and let him fly off into the world. And it made science so much more practical to our students. And it awakened within our students a desire to learn more about science. So nature study is a tool we have in our arsenal. We have lots of tools as homeschoolers to present the hands-on aspect of science. So we can use demonstrations, we can use experiments, and we can use nature study. And how we choose to use those tools will differ based on our kids' age, based on what our life situation is at that time. As far as nature study goes, there are two basic types of nature study. We have the formal nature study, which is much more structured, more planned, more thought out. We'll have specific topics to study and things like that each week. And then we have informal nature study, which is much more laid back. This can be as simple as seeing something interesting in nature and stopping to observe it. So those are your two main types. We'll have formal and informal nature study, and let's take a closer look at both of those. So let's take a look at formal nature study. As I said before, a formal nature study is a little bit more structured, so you're going to have a plan for your nature study. And there's going to be two components to formal nature study. You're going to have the nature walk and the nature journal. For the nature walk, you are planning a time within your week to head outside. As you go out on this walk, you are looking for something specific. So you're preparing ahead of time questions that you want to ask your students about the topic, and you're kind of gathering a bit of knowledge for yourself beforehand so that you can answer most of the questions that they have. So you'll head out on your nature walk and you will look for something specific, whatever your topic is that week. So you can go to a park, you can go to a hiking trail, you can go to your backyard, you can go to grandma's house for this nature walk. But basically, you're going to be spending, at least 15 minutes looking for this specific topic outside. And then when you find what you're looking for, you're going to stop and observe it and discuss it. And don't be afraid if your kids ask you questions and you don't know the answer, because one of the most powerful things we can say to our kids is, I don't know, let's look it up. Because we are modeling lifelong learning to our students, which after all is part of the reason we homeschool, because we want our students to be lifelong learners. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know. It's not a sign of weakness. It's not a sign that you don't know enough to teach your kids. Instead, it models lifelong learning, that there are times when we won't know everything, and what we do is look it up. Thanks to smartphones, that's a lot easier, and we can look things up in the field as long as we have connection. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know. But when you go on your nature walk, this is a walk with purpose. So in a nutshell, your nature walk is a walk with purpose. You're going outside, you're looking for something specific, you're going to find it, observe, discuss, and then you'll head back inside. Or you'll sit there and you'll do the second part, which is your nature journal sheet. So your nature journal can be done in the field, or you can head back home to do it, whichever you prefer. But this is a very personal record. So your students are personalizing what they've learned, and the key here is to make sure that it's a reflection of what they observed and what they learned when they were out in the field, because if we do that, then they're more likely to internalize it. Now, that said, even though I want my students' nature journals to be a very personal record of what they've learned, I always ask them to include at least one fact that we discussed about the topic and the date in which we did our nature study. The reason for the one fact is because, well, it is science, and we want to make sure that they've taken away at least one fact about the topic that we're observing. And then the reason why we add the date is because we can go back and look at our nature journal and see how things have changed through the years. So for instance, we have blueberry bushes in our backyard. Let's say we're doing a nature study for a couple of weeks on different cultivated crops. And so for one particular week, we looked at strawberries, and now we're looking at blueberries. And when we go outside for our blueberry nature study, we're observing the plants, we're sharing with our kids a little bit about blueberry bushes and, how tall they grow, what they look like, talking about the shape of the bell shape of the flower. And so giving them a little bit about the plant, and then they're writing their nature journal sheet. And in that, say, for instance, my student is going to say, blueberry has a bell-shaped flower that develops into a fruit. So that's their one fact. And then they're writing, we observed fruit that was ripe and ready to eat on May 15th. So I can go back 2-3 years from then and say, hey, 2 years ago, we saw ripe fruit on our plant on May 15th. Or 2 years ago, we saw our blueberry plants flower in the beginning of April. And then we can kind of begin to observe the changes in the seasons. So this year, our blueberries fruited May 1st. We were eating blueberries off our plants. That's a lot earlier than the previous year. And so we can see trends year after year. So that's why I ask my students to include dates in their nature journal as we make observations, because then we can see how that changes year after year. Does that make sense? Okay, so a couple of resources for formal nature study. We have the Handbook of Nature Study blog by Barb McCoy. This is excellent. Not only the Handbook of Nature Study book, but she partners it with Nature Studies for you. I think there's a membership side where you can get more detailed nature study books and stuff like that. So that's a good resource for you if you want nature study planned out for you and ready to go. There's also the Nature Explorer books by Cindy West at Our Journey Westward. Those are also nature study resources where you've got a little bit of a nature study planned out for you. And then we have InstaScience. It's kind of a digital nature study that I share on elementalblogging.com. So those are 3 resources that you can look to help you plan out your formal nature study. So if you don't want to use formal nature study that's planned out and you have specific topics, you're looking for specific things, you're doing that nature walk, you're doing that nature journal. What about the other option, informal nature study? So informal nature study can be the icing on your science cake. It can be that extra thing you add in. It may not be your main program or your main vehicle for teaching science like formal nature study can be. Informal nature study is more of an addition to your regular plan. And this is because it's spontaneous usually. So it's seeing something on a regular walk or while playing outside and then stopping to observe it. So we're outside playing in our backyard and we see a pine cone that's fallen from the tree that's opened up, and we go over and we observe it. We see the scales of the pine cone. We observe how hard it is. We look up in the tree to see where it fell from. We can try to identify that tree if we want to, or we can take the pine cone and stick it in some water and have the scales close up. It can be more complicated. We can do more things, or it can just be very simple. And typically informal nature study is very simple. It's about following rabbit trails. Like literally, we see the impression of a rabbit's footprint and we follow the rabbit trail. So that's what informal nature study is about. It's a chance for us to observe and discuss the environment that's around us every day. And still, again, in informal nature study, we're probably going to say, I don't know, let's look it up a lot more often than formal nature study because we haven't prepared ourselves for it, and that's totally fine. The whole point of informal nature study is to stop and learn. So instead of the stop, drop, and roll, we're stop, look, and listen, okay? So we're stopping, we're looking around, and we're listening for anything in nature that we find interesting. So you can be outside with your kids or on a walk with your kids and let's say, all right, stop, look, and listen. And then we can find something to observe for an informal nature study. It may take 30 seconds. It may take 5 or 10 minutes because we find something that we want to follow and learn more about. And this way of learning about science becomes very meaningful because it's in the context of real life. So I like to call Informal Nature Study a mini science class on the fly. So you're teaching about the topics or the principles in science as they present themselves. Okay, does that make sense? So formal nature study is planned out. You're preparing for it. You go on the nature walk. You have a nature journal. Informal nature study happens within the context of your life when you're playing outside or walking or whatever. You find something, you learn more about it. Okay? So where does nature study fit in? So we've got these two options, and we see the benefits of nature study, but how does it fit into our homeschool science plan? Or how can we fit nature study into our homeschool science plan? Really, there's three main options of how to incorporate nature study into our plan. And what you choose to do really depends upon your goals for teaching science, the ages of your students, things like that. So first of all, our first option is that nature study can be the core of our plan. So in this case, we're using formal nature study, and we're using that as the main vehicle for teaching science to our kids. So we're not planning extra experiments and things like that. We're just using nature study as our main part. And how is this possible? Well, so you must have these three things when you're teaching science. The first is some kind of hands-on, whether that is experiments, demonstrations, nature study, but some kind of chance for your students to see science face-to-face. And the second thing you need is you need to gather information. So your students need to either read about science, watch videos about science, observe and learn about science, have discussions or lectures about science, but they need to gather information about science. And then they need to keep a record of that. So they need to do some kind of written work because that will help them to remember what they've learned in the hands-on and in the information gathering. What they've learned from those two keys. The third key of keeping a record will help to solidify that. So we need to have those three keys in any plan for homeschool science. Let's take a look at how nature study can do that. So first of all, the hands-on aspect. Well, we have our nature walk, our walk with purpose. In our formal nature study, we're doing that nature walk where we're encountering science face-to-face. So we're studying amphibians, and we go out and look for frogs, and we see this frog on the side of our building or on the side of our garage, and we notice how he is able to stay on the side of the tree or on the side of the garage or whatever, wherever we find him. We do some observations about our frog, and we learn about amphibians through observing them in their natural environment, okay? And we see them hands-on. We see that face-to-face. And then secondly, we're gathering information. So how are we gathering that information? Well, we're looking in field guides. We're doing more research. We're having a discussion about this. We're making observations about our frog. There are lots of ways we can gather information when it comes to nature study. As far as field guides go, I really like the Peterson and the Audubon field guides. Those are great ones to get. Having them on hand, if you know that you're going to be studying a certain topic, like you're going to be spending 12 weeks on birds, then I would get a field guide for your area to take with you when you do your nature walks. That way you can look up the birds you find right then and there. Okay, so that's way you can get that information in the field, or you can come back and learn more about it when you get back to your house. And then the third aspect, so we have our hands-on nature walk, we have gathering information from our observations and our discussions, and we can keep a record. And our record is our nature journal. So our kids are taking pictures of what they've seen or drawing sketches of what they've seen, and then they're writing down one or two facts of their personal observations of what they learned about whatever topic we found. Okay, so does this make sense? With the formal nature study, you have those three keys. You have the hands-on aspect, you have information, and you have keeping a record. You have those three keys, so formal nature study can act as the core of your science plan. Our second option for adding nature study to our homeschool plans is to have it as the icing on the cake. And this can be formal planned out nature study, or it could be informal nature study on the fly. So when you use nature study as the icing on your cake, you keep your current science program. So if you like what you're doing with science, or you want a more structured science plan, you can keep that and then add in nature study 1 day a week. You can do that as formal nature study, so you can plan a topic that coordinates with whatever you're learning in your core science plan, and you can go look for that topic in nature study, or you can just do an informal nature walk and learn what you learn. So this is the option that we use for nature study, and we incorporate nature study on what we call Friday Fun Day. We take 1 day a week and we kind of scale back on what our plans are. So I don't do science or history on those days. We're just doing basically reading and math. And then we have a trip to the library. We do our nature study. We do our art and music. And it makes for a fun day for our kids. So we call that Friday Fun Day. And that's how we fit nature study into the icing of our cake. And then finally, your third option for adding nature study into your homeschool science plans is what I call the occasional treat. So we can have it be the core of our plans, we can have it be the icing on our cake, or we can have it as the occasional treat. And basically, when you use nature study as the occasional treat, we just fit it in wherever we can. So this is really your informal nature study, where you are taking advantage of what you're seeing. So you study nature as it presents itself when you have time. So for instance, it's a nice day and we are outside in the backyard playing soccer. And I look up and I notice the clouds are really awesome that day. So I say, hey kids, look up, look at these clouds. And we take a few minutes to observe the clouds we see, to talk about the different types of clouds, whether we look that up or whether I share that information with the kids. Either way is fine. And we just discuss what we see. And then we go back to playing. And that's how nature study can be the occasional treat. So it's not really planned out. It's just something you do as a part of life. And when you add nature study in this way, there's endless possibilities. You're only limited by what you see. Does that make sense? So now that we've kind of talked about what formal and informal nature study are and how we can fit those two options into our plans for homeschool science, let's answer the number one question I get about nature study. And that's, is nature study enough? Because it seems so easy. We go outside, we observe some things, we talk about it, and then we write down what we've learned, we take a few pictures, and that's all science is. Can that really be enough? Is nature study enough to count for science? Well, most definitely yes. In the younger years, yes, nature study is enough. It fulfills the 3 keys to teaching science. And if it fulfills your goals for teaching science, then yes, nature study is enough to teach your kids in the elementary years. It sparks a desire for them to learn more. So we talked about how nature study can awaken the scientific side of a brain in the way a good book can awaken the imagination. You know, our main goal for teaching science in the elementary years is to create within our children a desire to learn more. And nature study can do that. So in that way, yes, formal nature study is enough. It can be enough for elementary science because we've got the 3 keys as a part of the formal nature study, and it can help spark a desire for our students to learn more. But there's always a but, isn't there? But no, nature study is not enough on its own as our students get older. So for the middle school years, we are building on this foundation we've created in the elementary years. And we can definitely use nature study to create a great foundation for science in the elementary years. But as they get to middle school, your goal is to build upon that basic foundation that they learn. And then your second goal is to use inquiry-based methods. So you want them to discover more about science through inquiry-based methods. And though this is possible through nature study, really experiments are the way that students can get these inquiry-based methods. So they can learn more about fermentation reactions by doing the experiment that the yeast blows up a balloon. And they can test different temperatures to see how that affects the amount of carbon dioxide that's produced. Have you seen this experiment? Basically, you put a little sugar and some warm water and some yeast in the bottom of a bottle, and then you cover that with a balloon. And as the yeast begins to ferment and create carbon dioxide, it blows up the balloon. And of course, the temperature of the water matters, because if it's cold, not as many yeast will wake up and eat and produce the gas. If it's too hot, you'll kill the yeast and none of them will wake up and eat the sugar and produce the gas. So we want our kids to do this kind of inquiry-based method where they're learning, they're doing an experiment where they're testing different factors as they get older. Okay, so we don't necessarily need to do that in the younger years, but as they get older into middle school, high school, definitely they need to be using these inquiry-based methods. And it's a little challenging to create that within the nature study walk and journal. And plus, our middle school and our high school students need to be learning a little bit deeper principles in science, so they need some outside reading as well. Can we still use nature study with our kids at that age, the middle school and high school age? Most definitely. Nature study can be a family activity. It just means that for our middle school and our high school years, we need to add in some experiments and some additional reading about the topics and not just count only our formal nature study as their science plan. Does that make sense? So in a nutshell, yes, nature study is enough for the younger years. It's got those 3 basic keys, and it's got all our elementary kids will need. It'll meet our goals of sparking a desire to learn more. But no, for our older kids, nature study is great to still use with them, but we need to add in some additional information and some additional hands-on experiments, and they need to write a bit more than just a simple nature journal sheet. So yes, for the younger years, add in more for the older years. Does that make sense? Great. Now that we understand what nature study is, we know the difference between formal and informal, we have an idea of how we can fit it into our week, we know if it's enough for our elementary and middle school students, let's talk about tips, a few tips to succeed with nature study. Tip number 1, be prepared. If you're using formal nature study, you need to be prepared. You need to have a plan. You need to do a bit of research or reading yourself beforehand. Have those field guides on hand for you and your students to use, whether you check them out from the library or whether you purchase them, but you need to have those things on hand and be prepared. If you're doing informal nature study, you can be prepared by having different ID apps on your phone. So for instance, the Audubon app, VT Tree has a good tree identification app, but different apps on your phone to help you identify what you're seeing in informal nature study is a way you can be prepared for that. The second tip I have is for you to set aside enough time. Nature study is not a 5-minute activity, usually. Now, informal nature study on the fly can be a 5-minute activity. But if you're doing formal nature study, or if you're setting out to do some kind of nature study each week, allow yourself, at least 30 minutes, possibly up to an hour, to really enjoy and observe and discuss and create those nature journal pages. So make sure you set enough time aside so you won't be pressured to rush through your observations or rush through making your nature journal pages so you can get on to the next thing. Instead, make sure you've built in enough padding and enough time for your nature study. Number 3, don't be afraid. Be willing to say, I don't know, because remember, I don't know is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign that we are interested in lifelong learning when we add the phrase, I don't know, let's look it up. Okay? When we say let's look it up, we're modeling lifelong learning for our students. So don't be afraid to say, I don't know, and don't be afraid to use the resources that you prepared in the first tip to find out the answers to your students' questions. And your 4th tip, pack a backpack. So when you pack your backpack, carry some of those essential supplies so that it'll be easier for you to spend 30 minutes to an hour outside. Always carry water. If you live in a place where the sun is pretty intense, make sure you have sunscreen or bug spray if the bugs are crazy. Bring along paper, a pencil. Bring along your phone or a camera. Bring along those field guides. Bring along your students' journals. You can bring along colored pencils if you want. You could also bring along watercolored pencils. Those are fun to draw with, and then use a bit of your water to kind of paint over. So pack a backpack with the supplies that you're going to need for your nature study. And then the fifth tip is to enjoy yourselves, because nature study should be fun. Hands-on science should be fun. We should enjoy it. So follow those rabbit trails. Literally, follow the bird trails. Play poo sticks with your kids by dropping twigs you find along the way. Skip rocks along the pond. Whatever you do, take some time within your nature study to enjoy yourselves. Enjoy being out in the beautiful world that surrounds us every day. And then you can observe and learn about your environment. So I hope you have a better understanding of what nature study is, how nature study can bring science to life. And you understand the difference between a structured formal nature study plan and an informal nature study, and how we can fit those into our homeschool science plan or our plan for homeschool science. Nature study is really just simply about finding the principles of science in nature. If you have any questions about nature study, I will be down in the elemental science booth where you can see our brand new book, The Homeschooler's Guide to Experiments. And this book has a whole section set aside on nature study, and a lot of the things we discussed today are a part of that. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you guys head out at some point in this next month and enjoy nature and learn about science and maybe even get a little muddy.